Hello, welcome to our first week of Introduction to Sociology. I'm Matthew Irvin, your course facilitator, and we'll be going over what sociology is, what we need to do, what we do with it, why it's a science, and some of the highlights of sociology. Okay, so sociology is basically a study of human society. Well, what does that mean? Okay. Essentially, what we're talking about is the study of humans in groups. Now, a group can be as small as you and maybe your boyfriend or girlfriend, or you and your parents, or some small group, you and your best buddy. And it could be a group can be as large as an entire society. Okay, so that's a pretty broad breadth. But sociology basically studies human society and humans in groups. So a society is basically a group of people with a common bond. Now, common bond doesn't mean agreement. You often hear in contemporary conversation, well, society looks like it's going to fly apart, That's because there's less consensus about what that means. What society is, what the common bonds are. However, as Americans, we basically all have a definition of what it means to be an individual. We all have a definition of what it means to be successful. These are things that are common, even though common doesn't necessarily mean we always agree with each other. I want to make that clear. So a social science, why is this a science? Well, is it a science like physics? Well, not necessarily. A social science uses the scientific method, which we're going to discuss in a moment, to examine the social world. A social world could be anthropology. That usually compares different cultures. Psychology starts with the individual and kind of works out from there. Economics talks about how we arrange our material world. Political science, history, and sociology. So the sociological perspective is looking at the world through a sociological lens. What does that mean? The sociological imagination allows us to understand the relationship between our individual circumstances and larger social forces. Well, what does that mean? Okay, I'll give you a good example from our own recent history. A man named C. Wright Mills coined this term, sociological imagination, in the mid-20th century. And he was a brilliant analyst of society, and he provided the following definition. He said, we all live at the intersection of history and biography, which means, for example, what's the biggest example I can give you right now that we've all lived through? Well, we all just got done living through COVID, didn't we? That was certainly profound. So the sociological imagination allows us to understand the relationship between our individual circumstances and larger social forces. Okay? Your experience being in high school, for example, many of you are high school students, was much different than mine would have been. Or was. When I was in high school, we didn't have a pandemic. Okay? So, a psychological argument versus a sociological argument explains, for example, why things are the way they are. If we look, for example, at credit card debt, a psychological examination would look at your motivations, your lack of locus of control, maybe, impulse control. The assumption would be you're impulsive. However, a sociological analysis might step back. I mean, do you have to use a credit card to pay your heating bill? I mean, what are you spending that credit card debt on? Many people, again, the pandemic went into credit card debt to extraordinary lengths in order to survive, to pay their bills. Maybe they had no choice. So, social forces, things like race, class, social class, gender, religion, the way our economy is configured, or politics, create the context of a person's life. For example, the political, the debate about people wearing masks, etc., it all created a difficult or a different situation for folks. So we tend to look at society in different levels. For our purposes, we're going to look, again, I said small groups as a focus. Microsociology looks at small groups. A group can be as few as 2 people. Macrosociology, on the other hand, studies big groups. For example, a microsociologist might study how a family with 2 kids navigated work and school during the pandemic. Whereas a macrosociologist might look at big group processes, like, for example, how people negotiated mask mandates in Walmart. Like any social science, sociology has theories. A theory explains systematically how society works. Theories explain the social world from some perspective. Now, the word theory, we don't want to talk about it like you talk about it in the vernacular. In other words, a theory is not like just a fiction. It's simply a narrative, a systematic narrative that we use to explain social phenomena. A macro-sociological theory might be, there are 2 that we tend to focus on. Structural functionalism and conflict theory, which we'll go into in just a moment. A micro-sociological theory, symbolic interactionism, how we construct the world through our everyday interaction. We also kind of look at rational choice theory as well. It's not included here, but we'll talk about that in a bit. A paradigm is a set of assumptions, theories, and perspectives that make up a way of understanding social reality. For example, if I'm looking at income inequality since 1980, we're going to look at we can look at the way wages were distributed across the population. That's a big theory. That would be perhaps a conflict theory. Combining these theories creates a paradigm to provide a systematic narrative through which we can test explanations about how society works. So let's look at these 3 basic sociological paradigms. Structural functionalism holds that society is a unified whole that functions because of the contributions of its separate structures and institutions working sort of together as if they were a very large machine. An early theorist of structural functionalism was Emile Durkheim. He was originally from Belgium, and he studied how communities varied in suicide rates in one of the first landmark sociological studies ever done. He looked at social bonds. Social bonds exist in all societies, but different societies create different bonds, and society holds these together. What Durkheim's central insight was from was that, for example, suicide in communities that were cohesive, in other words, where there was a strong sense of community, the suicide rates tended to be lower than in places where people didn't tend to know each other. And there's some different elements of how society is bonded together. Solidarity, the degree of integration or unity within a particular society. The extent to which individuals feel connected to other members of their group. I'll give you an example. Now, again, we look at social patterns. We don't analyze the value of a particular perspective necessarily, right? But in Utah, for example, okay, most of the people are members of the Church of Latter-day Saints, the Mormons, right? One of the tenets of their religious belief is that they don't smoke tobacco, okay?